Okay, so happy to have you all here. Nice big group today. We are continuing our conversation from the last few weeks, and I'll put it in the chat again, just because I know a few of you joined in right after I posted it. This is a link to the YouTube channel where you can find all the previous sessions where we talked about all sorts of different subjects. And this is, we're on our third week here talking about this subject, but each week we've learned something new about this sort of fundamental question about what are the benefits of fulfilling mitzvot? What are we getting from this experience? And I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see where we started. Can everybody see this? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Yes, awesome. And I'll remind you, since there are so many of us, you could. It's certainly helpful but not required for you to use the raised hand function, which is under reactions. Just that's helpful for me, but if you wave into the screen long enough, I'm sure I'll see you. Okay. We started with this Mishnah, and just as a reminder, my teacher, Rabbi Patricia Fenton, would regularly say, review is where all the learning happens, so we're going to do a quick review. We started with this Mishnah, right, which is a text from the 1st and 2nd centuries, written in Hebrew in the land of Israel, by the first sort of core generation of rabbis called the Tanaim, who made these two statements, right? Anyone who performs one mitzvah has goodness bestowed upon them, their life is lengthened, and they inherit the land. And land has been interpreted here to mean the life in the world to come, right? So it's not a geographical answer, it is a spiritual answer, if you will, theological answer. And anyone who does not perform one mitzvah does not have goodness bestowed upon them. Their life is not lengthened, and they do not inherit the land, which is to say the world to come. And so we've been slowly unpacking this Mishnah in the Gemara, in the section of Talmud that follows, which is the later generation of rabbis, the Amoraim, who are sort of unpacking and arguing and disagreeing and trying to find all of the sources for these materials. And so we sort of asked the questions, well, what does one mitzvah mean? What does goodness mean? What does inheritance mean? What is the deed enough or thought process? And we sort of unpacked lots and lots of different things there. We're not going to review all of it. I want to pull out a few highlights. One is that the Gemara begins by referencing this Mishnah from Mishnah Peah, which often shows up in the Sidur, which says that there are matters that people engage in and they get the benefits in this world, but the major benefits are in the world to come, which are the mitzvot of honoring one's parents, acts of love and kindness, hospitality towards guests, and bringing peace between people. And as you might have heard before, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that Torah study is equal to all of them, right? So if you have a giant scale, one side has all of these mitzvot, the other has Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. So we have this sort of list of mitzvot. We talk about, well, maybe it's any mitzvah we're talking about gets the benefits, or it's one of these. We talk about whether or not it's one mitzvah on one day. We talk about it's sort of at the end of life, we're sort of doing an evaluation. And we had this one conversation here by Rabbi Yaakov, who says, there is no reward for a mitzvah in this world, only in the next. And part of that is this fundamental question, which is we have these rabbis who are experiencing a profound amount of suffering and violence, and it's hard for them to then see all these good things happening to bad people and bad things happening to good people as a broad strokes here. And I can hear somebody. I'm just going to okay. So then we get this example where we have quoted. Oh, I hear somebody unmuted. Oh, here we go. We have these two mitzvot mentioned in the Torah. One is for honoring one's parents, that your days may be long and it may go well with you, right? So the benefit seems to be that long life. And we have this specific mitzvah of sort of shooing away a mother bird from a nest, and before you take the eggs. And it says in the Torah that it may be well with you, that may prolong your days. Sort of the same framework, meaning to say that your life should be lengthened. And then here's the piece where we sort of ended last week, and we're going to pick up this week, which is we have this scenario in which a parent says to their child, go climb up and fetch me the chicks or the eggs or whatever, the shooing away of the mother bird, right? So the person is then fulfilling both mitzvot. And in the story, this person falls and dies. The child falls and dies. And the Gemara asks, where's the goodness of the days of this one? Where is the length of days of this one? Reasonably, we might say, if the two things of having goodness and long life are the benefits for these mitzvot, and this person clearly doesn't get those things, well, we've got a problem. And one resolution of it is that it may be well with you refers to where all is well and to where everything is really good, and that your days may be long is referring to a world that is entirely long, right? It's not really about you, it's about the world as a whole. And then the Gemara does something so fascinating. Again, this is a sort of review where we'll pick up in a second, jumping in anew, which is, what if maybe this incident never existed, right? This is where like historiography starts to show up in the Talmud, which it doesn't exist in the same way. But that gets rejected because Rabbi Yaakov, the one who believes that there's no reward in this world, says, no, I saw an incident like this. I've seen this happen, right? And then we have this interesting question, which is, does this person who falls, fulfilling a mitzvah and dies, perhaps they were contemplating sin? And we have the answer that no, God does not link a bad thought to a bad action or to an action, right? So that thoughts alone don't get you punished. And then we have this last piece, which is maybe they were contemplating idol worship, because we have this quote in Ezekiel. And then we have this last sentence. Rabbi Yaakov is saying this as well, if it enters your mind, which usually it doesn't for us, but that there is a reward for performing a mitzvah in this world, why didn't these mitzvot protect him, this person who had fallen and died, that he should not contemplate idol worship? Meaning to say, mitzvot have an additional benefit. They keep you away from sinful thoughts, which is a fascinating theological statement. You don't have to agree, certainly an argument being made here. But it asks this other question, sort of in parallel, which is, something that people might have heard before, which is, on the path to doing a mitzvah, aren't you protected? Which is where the Gemara picks up from here, and that's where we're going to start today. I know that was a lot of information dumping, but I see some new faces and see some folks who haven't been here in a while. I want to make sure we were all more or less on the same page. So before we go on, everybody take a deep breath. Anybody have any questions, statements, sermons, counter sermons before we jump on? Yeah, Nelson.
So there's a custom when someone's going on a long trip, someone else may give you money to donate to charity when you arrive. And since you're on a trip to perform a mitzvah, you're protected.
Right. There is this custom that if you're on the path of doing a mitzvah, in this case, the giving of tzedakah, you are then protected. So yes, I think that is mirrored in what we're about to read. Absolutely. Great. David and then Bob.
So maybe this was covered, and I think you kind of alluded to it in the summary review, but when I read through this, because we missed the last couple of weeks and I wanted to at least try to get a running start, though it's perilous to read this alone. It seems to me it can't really mean something about specific rewards to an individual, at least in this world. So maybe what it means is if people are doing mitzvot, they're helping to create a better world, and a better world is a kind of reward because it's a better world where people behave better towards one another. I don't know, but it seems to me like they're struggling with the Mishnah because it doesn't seem to be true. And if it's a Mishnah, doesn't it have to be? And maybe we're going to get there in the end, but all this talk about rewards for individual people, I thought we're supposed to do mitzvot because it's the right thing, not because we're looking for a reward. And And maybe that's what the struggle's about here, but I'm just letting you know that I'm struggling with that. And I'm trying to think about it in the way I presented, but I don't know if that's where we're going to end up going or whether that makes any sense at all. So
yeah. So I think, first of all, I think it's reasonable to be struggling with it because the rabbis are clearly struggling with it, right? They're seeing people suffering. Rabbi Akiva gets burned at the stake. We learned last week that Rabbi Yaakov is a, let me double check, a descendant of, he is a descendant of Elisha ben Abuya, which you can find here, who is known as a known apostate, someone who rejects rabbinic Judaism, right? So there's a lot of struggling going on here. So I think you're in good company. So a few things. One is, I do think the Gemara is talking about individual reward for the most part. Whether or not we should think of it that way is a different question, but I do think that that's what they're thinking about. With the following exception, which is this section here, which is, I think you summarized really well, which is that mitzvot is really not about us as individuals, but our collective experience. And I think that's what this section means here. And I think that mirrors so well what the rabbinic enterprise seems to emphasize, which is that it's not of us. We don't have rights in Judaism. We have obligations. It's about the community. It's not about us as individuals. So I absolutely think that there is a role there. And I think that's a worthy way of experiencing mitzvot, that it's not just about me, it's about what we're doing for each other and with each other and all of that. So I think that's great. I think the question of whether or not we end in one particular place or not, the Gemara never ends where you think it's going to end. So we can take lessons along the way, even if it doesn't end there. Bob.
I guess I better unmute. I want to say that I agree with what David's saying. I'm just thinking about it in a different direction, I guess. I think what they're questioning tends to show that there is no connection between mitzvot and rewards. Consequently, the balance to that is there's also no punishment for not doing mitzvot. But where they're looking at the rewards may be totally wrong, that they're just disconnected.
Yeah, I think this is the thing we all experience, and I think the rabbis are experiencing as well, which is that it seems as though there is no connection between our actions and our quote unquote reward, right? The Torah says we're going to have long life, and then it doesn't happen. And so the rabbis are desperately seeking an answer to this question that we're still having, right? And so I think that's exactly right, which is the rabbis don't have an answer. And so they're seeking one, whether that answer is, well, the world is better off, or, well, you get it after, in the world to come, right? In this realm, this existence that's not the same as our own. I think that's exactly right. I think it is reasonable, and David made reference to this before, and I certainly feel this way. Like, I don't think we have any real answers. And so it's about, the Talmud is certainly inviting us in this conversation, and us as modern readers and people who are studying this in this, B'nai Yeshurun class, that we too are struggling with it, right? And look, as far as I know, I don't know anyone who's offered a consistent answer as to why things happen the way they do, other than each of us who sort of make our attempt. Sheila, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we're going to read ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Two things. One is, what it comes out sounding is that religion, at least Judaism, always leaves us, we don't have answers in Judaism. Christianity has answers, the Muslims have answers. We don't. We acknowledge that there are questions that don't have answers. Now, I mean, I don't know, whether I'm totally correct or not, because I haven't studied the other religions that much, but they certainly give the idea that, we've got the answer. And you have, I think, some of the Haredim also, they have the answer. I think as rabbis, they don't have the answer, but they project it to their congregation, because otherwise, things would get crazy. The other thing is with examples, we have the example of the bird and the nest. In Cleveland, we've had some tragedies where we had this young kid who went to on Lag BaOmer, and he was crushed, when something collapsed. He was just innocent there. And then we had another kid who went at yeshiva, somebody drove by and just shot him, a random shooting. So it's interesting, they use the bird and the nest rather than individuals, people. But
yeah, so I think a few things. One is, I think those kinds of scenarios, and they're using the bird in the nest as an example, where these really tragic things happen, and we're left bereft with any real answers to explain it. And to put it succinctly, it sucks. It sucks to be in this position of saying, I don't know how to explain this terrible thing that has happened. And so I think that this is part of what the rabbis are trying to unpack. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I'm no expert in Christianity and Islam, and my encounters with them have offered enough gray area that they also seek answers to that they don't have, right? They have questions that they don't have answers to. And I do think that each tradition is offering an answer, us too, about how do we live a life worth living. When we studied about longevity a few weeks, maybe a month or two ago, we had a bunch of rabbis who offered here's the answer to how to live a life worth living, or a long life, I think was the context, right? And so I do think we have answers, whether or not they're the same answers or different answers or definitive, it's sort of a different question. I think the rabbis would certainly offer a life of kindness and tzedakah and justice and righteousness, and observance certainly would be a piece of the puzzle, are all part and parcel of living a life worth living. The answer to, what are we doing here? And so whether or not they have a definitive answer, here's the one that we all agree on, probably not. I think all of us in this room would probably come up with different answers, but I do think there are answers. They're not, they're all equally right and wrong, but there are answers. All right, Bill, I'm going to give you the last word, but then we're going to read ahead for real.
Sorry for raising my hand after you said that. So as you prefaced, a lot of the writings of the sages, the rabbis here, did come out from all of the awful things that were happening, and that's all in their mind. Well, all those awful things that were happening were predominantly exterior forces acting upon the Israelites. I know we go back on Tisha B'Av and we say, oh, it was our fault, but ultimately it's a lot of outside stuff. And yet what we're listening to here and seeing here is such an insular approach to a life that is not insular in many cases. You might have your little portion of the shtetl, but the rest of the world's around you. And it's phenomenal. It's a phenomena that has continued into modern day. Here it's like, the only way you can solve the problem or to fulfill the mitzvot and live within our Jewish world a certain way. And we're hoping that kind of keeps out the evil around us. And to Sheila's point, I recall when that poor boy, that had happened and there was a collapse in some of the Orthodox community. It was, well, we know how to fix this. Our women aren't dressed modestly enough, and they're not saying enough Psalms. And that's what we're going to do in reparation for or to prevent future issues. So here's an external situation, poorly constructed seating, and we take it on. I don't want to say as a victim, but it's like maybe we have the power to change it. So there's a positive side. Maybe we have the power to change it, but at the same time, there's no recognition here of a larger world outside of Judaism. And I know you can only change what you can change, but it almost seems, if you hear the wolves at night outside your window, and all you're told to do is, here's what you do inside your home. I don't know how that rings all that true.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is I want to be really careful, right, about the way we describe other denominations and other traditions, right? Because we can certainly speak about our own worldviews. We want to be careful about describing others. But yes, there are certainly answers of self-refinement, self-observance, things like that as answers to tragedy. And some of those answers are very reasonable, right? A deep spiritual practice has real value, right? Anyone who's been a chaplain or been in the hospital or been visited by a chaplain knows that spiritual practice can help in deeply tragic moments. So I'll say that to start with. The second is that, right, you made reference to this, right? Sinat Chinam, I think is Rav Kook, who comes back and says, okay, like, yes, this external thing happened, but it was as a result of our internal actions. And so there is a tension there. And so I'm not offering that, yes, one's right or one's wrong. Like, those are all pieces of the puzzle. The third thing I'll say, and I think it's important for us as sort of intellectual, for our context, which is the rabbis of the Talmud live a relatively cosmopolitan life, meaning to say they are living amongst their Zoroastrian neighbors in Babylonia. Their neighbors are not all Jews, right? That they're living amongst, just like we as modern people for the most part, living amongst lots of people of different persuasions. I live in a neighborhood that's predominantly Ethiopian and Eritrean. Like, that's fantastic. I get to learn about all sorts of things. And so I think the rabbis are experiencing something similar. Okay, let's move on a little bit, and let's say as following. So this is going to come back to what Nelson said at the very beginning, which is the Gemara says the following: but didn't Rabbi Elazar say that those on the path to perform a mitzvah are not susceptible to harm? Right? We could have put in Nelson's name in here, right? Didn't Nelson say, right? And just to remember that the bold here is the translation, and the not bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary. So Rabbi Steinsaltz plugs in here. How is it possible that this individual who is sent by their parent to perform a mitzvah could have died? Right? This fundamental question of a person is, right, just to remember what the scenario was, a person is asked by their parent, therefore honoring their parents, to do a task that's also explicitly mentioned in the Torah of having a positive outcome, right? How could they possibly have died? The Gemara answers. There, in the case of Rabbi Elazar, is referring to those on their way to perform a mitzvah, which is different, as one is not susceptible to harm when they are on their way to fulfill a mitzvah. In this case, the individual is harmed on their return, and one is not afforded protection after having performed a mitzvah. I love this answer. So first of all it says in the Aramaic, and I want to point this out because we want to learn how Gemara functions. Here it says Vaha Amar Rabbi Eliezer. This is what Rabbi Eliezer says. They are not. The people who are doing a mitzvah aren't damaged. They aren't harmed. Hatam. There in the other case, right? They're on their way. Sha'ani. Sha'ane means it's different. So again, Rabbi Steinsaltz is unpacking that for us. So we could come up with a different answer, but this is what Rabbi Steinsaltz is saying that the Gemara is saying, which is that that people who are on their way to do a mitzvah are protected, and those who are not, it's different. Meaning to say that this person had already performed the mitzvah, and therefore they are not covered by this. Just quick show of hands. How many people like this answer? Yeah, I think this is a terrible answer. It is pretty unsatisfying. So let's see how the Gemara navigates this. Can I get a volunteer to read this paragraph here? Maybe somebody whose voice we haven't heard yet today. Somebody want to read this Gemara asks. Yeah, Stephen.
The Gemara asks, but didn't Rabbi Elazar say that those on the path to perform a mitzvah are not susceptible to harm, neither when they are on their way to perform the mitzvah, nor when they are returning from performing the mitzvah?
All right, I'm going to pause you right there quickly, Stephen. I'm going to come back to you in a second. I love the fact, right? The Gemara has a proof text for this exact thing. At first, it said, well, we have this quote from Rabbi Elazar. Well, now we get a fuller quote. How lucky is that the rabbis have this exact quote? I think we should be a little suspicious, but it's still useful for us anyway. All right, please, Stephen, continue.
The Gemara answers, In that case, it was a rickety ladder, and therefore the danger was established. And anywhere that the danger is established, one may not rely on a miracle, as it is written with regard to Hashem's command to Shmuel to anoint David as king in place of Saul. And Samuel said, "How will I go? And Saul will hear and kill me." And God said, "Take in your hand a calf and say, I have come to sacrifice an offering to Hashem." Although God himself issued the command, there was concern with regard to the established dangers.
Amazing. Thank you, Stephen. So there's a lot happening here, right? So the Gemara says, okay, well, we have this answer that like, okay, you're on the way to the mitzvah, but on the way back, you're not protected. That feels kind of messed up. And so the Gemara says, well, wait a second. Didn't Rabbi Elazar say, you're covered no matter what? And the Gemara answers, I love this. So the Gemara is trying to save our case, right? We have this case, the Gemara is trying to protect it. We want that case to still stand. And how do we do that? It was a rickety ladder. I love this answer, right? It's not that the mitzvot didn't protect him, this person, right? It was, the ladder was not that great. It was an old ladder. It was broken in some way. And then we have this interesting principle. Anywhere that the danger is established, one may not rely on a miracle. Meaning to say, like, if it's broken and you try and climb it, God's not going to swoop in and save you.
Okay.
You've got it, like, it's a rickety ladder. You gotta be careful. You gotta be safe. And the example they give is that Samuel is headed to anoint David, right? So now God is, through Samuel, making a command. So now David is on the way, or Samuel is on the way to do a mitzvah. Everybody with me so far? Yes? So Samuel is on the way to do a mitzvah, and Samuel is concerned, I'm going to get killed on the way. And so that's the proof case, right? That like danger is danger, right? Samuel could have said, oh, I'm on a mitzvah, God sent me, I'm covered. No, there was a danger. He was concerned. That's our proof text to say, to prove the rickety ladder principle, if you will. Yeah, Sheila.
That makes me very, very unhappy.
Say more.
That there was a rickety ladder. In that case, the father is at fault because didn't he inspect the ladder? What about, the case in Jerusalem, in Meron, that's exactly the case there. They knew there was a defective trail up, but the case in Denver, I think, where the kid just innocently is walking by and gets shot. What kind of preparation? You can't make a preparation. There is no answer. This is exactly the quandary that Kushner said. When bad things happen to good, I wouldn't even say the word good person, innocent people would be a much better.
Yeah, so
like his kid was a kid still when he was diagnosed.
So I think a few things, right? Which is the rabbis are trying to make the point that these things are happening and we need to find an explanation for them. And so one answer is, well, they're suffering in this life because their reward is greater in the world to come. That was one answer that we explored. The second here is maybe the person was having idolatrous or sinful thoughts, and that we sort of rejected also. The third answer we have here is they made a bad choice. Now we could blame the parent, we could blame the child, fine, it could be an adult, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that this person was a child climbing the ladder. You can honor your parents regardless of how old you are. But that we have to look, we can't rely on God to swoop in and save us in a situation we shouldn't put ourselves in. That's the argument being made here, right? That we have to make good choices regardless of the other circumstances. Yeah, Sheila, you don't like my explanation.
No, because the kid was asked by the father. He didn't volunteer. This was just, Who are you
So
blaming?
I want to be clear. All it says that a person was asked by their parent. It does not say that it's a child.
Okay, the person then was asked. Okay, what if he had just volunteered?
Right. So I think
In other words, there is no, we're forcing an issue that happens all the time. The only question is, well, how are we, not how, but are we ever going to be satisfied with an answer? And I would propose that in Judaism, we never will be satisfied. That's what, that's the Holocaust, that's everything bad. The other religions, they say the world to come.
well, let's
put it, that everything they do when they die.
Let's leave other traditions out of it for the time being. But I think I want to say the following, which is, it's not that there are answers, whether or not they're satisfying or they fulfill us or we like them. The answers being given here are in conflict with one another, right? So part of our human nature is to try and find explanations for things. And part of whether or not those explanations fit or we like them or don't like them or they're problematic, all being true and possible. Okay, David and then Bill and then Nelson. Did I get everybody in the right order? I think so.
So following up on what Sheila said, if we imagine even that the person is not a child, but maybe is still a young adult, we could imagine that the father asking him to do it, he's sending somebody who might be, based on their age and lack of experience, a little over enthusiastic, a little not very careful. Maybe that's a mistake. On the other hand, I think it still boils down in a large measure to what Sheila is saying, that on the one hand, we want to find answers because we want the world to have some kind of organization to it, like it says essentially right at the beginning of Genesis. The creation might not have played out exactly like it says, but one of the things we like about the story is how beautifully organized everything is, and God found it good on top of everything else. So that's part of what we want the world to be. So when the world doesn't seem to be like that, some people would say, well, that's because everything you believe is nonsense. The world is just chaos, and just enjoy your time here because there won't be anything else anyway. And whatever you have here is still chaos, and you're just lucky to be alive. And we don't want to think of it that way. We want life to have meaning, and we want that meaning to go on once we're not here any longer ourselves. And I would argue that whatever there is after this world, which we don't know, and we don't speculate nearly as much as some of the other religions, we're trying to make this place better in part so that meaning continues and that meaning is better. Now, some people would say you're tilting at windmills, but we don't think we are. So when the rabbis are having this discussion, maybe that's all they're really trying to do, is figure out a way to make some meaning out of what seems senseless. I don't know, but that's another thought.
Yeah, so I'll only add the following, and I actually think Bill Satin, you made this point last week, which is we read the second paragraph of the Shema, right, which I think might be this week's portion or next week, pretty close to it. Or at least the Shema in general, but whatever, the second paragraph of the Shema, which outlines, do good, get good, do bad, get bad, as a premise. And that has real problems based on the whole conversation that we've been having. And so we're left trying to figure out, well, how does this work or not work? And I always sort of look at it as aspirational, right? That if I do good things will happen, and do bad. I want the world to be ordered in a way that it is more ordered than it currently is. Your points are well made. Absolutely. Bill and then Nelson.
I think this is clearly demonstrating the rabbis' both need and interest in pivoting the Jewish people away from a God-based adherence religion to, in this case, rules and halakha-based. Original temple practice, God dwelt, the temple was there, that's where God would come and meet with us, and we would perform acts, and he would smell things, and it would be pleasing, and it was very God focused. That didn't work out so well for us. And this now it's like, well, we're going to delegate God to maybe this world that comes later, not this world now. God also isn't going to come in and do a miracle for you. So in a way, they've removed God from the day to day, which in a way reflects, as you're saying, the world that they're living in. It's not a great world. And if God was in our world, and yet all of this bad stuff was happening, that would raise a lot of questions about the nature of God and why God's no longer protecting Israel and things like that. So you reframe where God's role is in the world. As David said, creation was a great thing, but he's kind of pulled away from involvement, and we're delegating him to these other areas. And what's replacing it is this adherence to mitzvot and ultimately halachic approach. And sometimes people are better being organized around rules that they could see outcomes to or not see outcomes to, rather than this idea of a God that's really not on their side anymore.
Right. Yeah, I'll just add that Rabbi Brad Artson makes an argument in one of his books that God can be good or all powerful and not both. Because if God was all good, then and all powerful, then those bad things wouldn't happen. Or we have to make the argument that God is good and therefore, but unable to act in a particular way. Nelson, and then we're gonna read ahead to and get to the next page.
I'm even more of a cynic. I think everybody's been correct, except we're all confident we know what's good. And what we know what we want, and we assume what we want is good for us. Who knows? And I don't mean who knows in the sense in which we shouldn't work at it. I think the secret is to work at these puzzles about life rather than to say we know all the answers. I don't think any religion is satisfied. When someone tells me that God wanted me to do something or rewarded me or something, I'm suspicious. I don't care what religion they are. And when I talk to people in other religions who are thoughtful, they have the same attitude. They're just not smug about the answers. Anyway, I'll just stop there. But I don't think these rabbis are smug. They're showing us how to work over their material and come up with more questions. And that's a positive, I would say. Yeah, great. Thank you for adding that. All right, let's read on a little bit ahead. I think this is a nice little twist where we get to actually make reference. We talked about acher last week. We're going to read the personality paragraph now, and we'll start to get sort of unpack another piece. And you can see with this symbol here, Rabbi Steinsaltz has offered for us, actually begins a slightly new thought. This is a really long section. I don't know that we'll read it all. We can decide as a group at the end of class if we want to keep unpacking this subject. Crystal, I saw your hand up before when I was talking for reading. If you'd like to read, I'd love to have you read here as well.
Sure. Starting at which section?
We're going to read acher. You're going to read these two paragraphs here. It's just the personality description. Acher.
Elisha ben Abuya was born in Jerusalem toward the end of the Second Temple period to a family that was one of the most prominent and wealthy in the city. As related in the Jerusalem Talmud, his family was under the sway of foreign cultures and did not maintain deep ties with Judaism. Nevertheless, Elisha received an extensive Jewish education, and his great talents earned him a place amongst the chief scholars of the day. Nevertheless, even while a member of the yeshiva, Elisha maintained his ties with Greek culture in its various manifestations, taking an interest in and reading heretical works. In addition to the story reported here, the Talmud offers other accounts of how severe emotional traumas, possibly connected to the Hadrianic persecutions, led Elisha to abandon Judaism entirely. Certain sources suggest that not only did he transgress the mitzvot, but he even cooperated with the Romans against his Jewish brethren, and many acts of cruelty are ascribed to him. This explains the enmity directed at him as early as the time of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi.
I just pause really fast. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is credited with the editing of the Mishnah. So even from the like a really early period, so clearly some conflict. Please continue.
Oof. Rabbi Meir was apparently the only one to maintain personal ties with the apostate. He even continued to learn Torah from Elisha, a controversial move at the time. More lasting than the immediate antagonism was the feeling of regret and pain over such a great scholar turned into a heretic, as well as the sense that Aher remained miserable even during his rebellion, but could not find the courage to repent after having acted so wickedly. It is for this reason that his statements are preserved. A proverb of his can be found in the Mishnah in Tractate Avot 420, while Avot de Rabbi Natan features an entire chapter of his moral sayings.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Crystal. All right, so there's a lot of information, but first of all, as I have shared before, these sections on personalities in the Koran Talmud are my absolute favorite because they add such valuable additional information and context. Context is so powerful that we have this individual who, Elisha ben Abuya, who apostatizes away from Judaism and is yet still a scholar worth learning, which again, all sorts of complicated emotions there. He is named as one of the four rabbis who enter Pardes, which is in Masechet Chagiga, and maybe we'll learn that text one day. And the last thing I want to say, again, there's lots of information here. Avot de Rabbi Natan is considered a commentary to Masechet Avot. Acher is a nickname. Acher means the other, meaning to say they didn't even want to. They wanted to include him, but they didn't want to name him, so they called him Acher, the other. The last thing I want to say is Rabbi Meir is one of the rabbis of the Mishnah. And anytime a Mishnah is not given credit to a rabbi, it's the anonymous voice, the Stam Mishnah, you can generally attribute it to Rabbi Meir. So the fact that Rabbi Meir, who is the anonymous voice of the Mishnah, is still studies from with Acher is an incredibly valuable piece of information. Okay, all of that as background to the following. Remember that Rabbi Yaakov mentioned before, right? Here is his great-grandson, I think, or grandson, I think, son of his daughter. Okay. Rabbi Yosef said, yes, Rebecca, as a driven leaf is about Elisha ben Abuya. Yes, thank you for adding that. Rabbi Yosef had Acher, literally translated as other, the appellation of the former sage Elisha ben Abuya, interpreted this aforementioned verse, it may go well with you, right, which was one of the phrases in the two mitzvot, homiletically, meaning to say with midrash, and here you could say, in the Aramaic, you could say drashe, it that he interpreted it, right? So not literally, but interpreting, as referring to the world to come, as did Rabbi Yaakov, the son of his daughter, he would not have sinned. Meaning to say, Rav Yosef is making the argument that if Acher had been less literal, he would not have left Judaism. He would not have sinned and left Judaism. That we should understand these things more metaphorically or homiletically is the way it's described here. The Gemara asks, what caused Acher to sin? There are those who say he saw a case like this, the case that we were talking about before of a child, presumably, or a son, or a descendant of somebody falling off of a roof, where a son went up on the roof and his father's command, dispatched by the mother bird, and then died. It was witnessing this episode that led Elisha ben Abuya astray. Right, so sort of making point to what Sheila had said before, we see all these terrible things. The Holocaust you made reference to is a great classic example in our life as we develop into theology. It's not unreasonable to see these terrible things happen and then say, you know what? I'm out. I'm done. Like, that's not an unreasonable thing to say. Now, that's not the answer I think we have come up with as a class of 17 individuals today, and here we're studying Torah, right? There's still what to be said, but it's not an unreasonable thing to see terrible stuff and then see, you know what, I'm out. Like, that's a reasonable response, not ours, but a reasonable one. I love this next part, right, where it says Ve'ika da'amre. Does everybody see this right here? Thumbs up if you can see it. It says Ve'ika da'amre. Awesome. So Ve'ika is the Aramaic word for yesh, there is. The Ika Amri is the phrase that means, and there are those who say, which is going to offer an alternative. Ika Amri. Yesh Omrim, there are those who say. So we're going to get an alternative. So here we have the question, what caused Acher to sin? So one answer is, right, Ika Amri, we see it up here. There are those who say it was a case like this. But Ika Amri, we have an alternative. There are those who say that he saw, right, Elisha ben Abuya saw the tongue of Chutzpit, the disseminator, so a person we get to, we'll read down below, after the latter was executed by the government, thrown in the street and dragged along by something else, a euphemism for a pig, right? They didn't even want to say it. He said, shall a mouth that produced pearls lap up dirt? For this reason, he went out and sinned, right? You saw a teacher, basically not only killed by the government, but desecrated. It's like, for this is the reason why I do all this stuff, because of this. And again, we talked about the story of last week. We talked about the story of Moses and in Rabbi Akiva's classroom, where Moses is putting all the crowns on the letters, asks about it, and God says, well, it's this Rabbi Akiva guy. And then Moses at the end says, well, what's the reward to this guy? And he gets burned at the stake. And here we'll just very briefly look at this guy, Chutzpit, which also, what a great name, Chutzpit. I love that. Rabbi Chutzpit was the disseminator in Yavne. The Hebrew here is Hamaturgaman, the translator, person who is making it understandable. His own statements are cited in both the Mishnah and the Tosefta. We haven't talked about the Tosefta yet, which we'll talk about in a second. He apparently lived to an old age. However, he was killed by the Romans during the times of the decrees of persecution, as listed among the 10 martyrs, which you may have noticed pretty recently when we talked about them. Okay. I think in either of these cases, we have Acher, who sees two horrific things and says, you know what? I'm done. This is too much for me. Again, not the answer we encourage, but I think the Gemara is saying, you know what? We get it. Like these are really tough things. Again, it's sort of that weird, complicated thing. What I want to do is the following. I want to define what the Tosefta is, and then we'll stop here, and we'll spend the last 10 minutes of our class sort of just chatting as a group and unpacking this. The Tosefta is a parallel text to the Mishnah. So the Mishnah was one version of rabbinic teaching. The Tosefta was a parallel version that was less edited. So it has a lot of similar texts, but not exactly the same. It has all sorts of additional stuff that didn't show up in the Mishnah. The Tosefta is one of the primary sources of Baraitot. If you remember right in the Gemara, it's quoting a Tanaitic source. It says, we're quoting a Baraita. Many of those Braitot are coming from the Tosefta. So if you study them, often when I was in rabbinical school, we would study the Mishnah of a section, we would study the Tosefta, and then we would study the Gemara, because between all of that, we would have like all of the grounding material. Okay, that's just context and background. Okay, we have this story about Elisha ben Abuya. We have all these questions about reward and punishment and suffering and our understanding of the nature of the universe. By the way, we're only talking about serious things today, the nature of the universe itself. What do people think? Where are you sitting? I love for the folks who haven't had anything to say, who haven't had a chance to say something, to get priority. So if you haven't said something and you want to, now is a good, I want to give you a chance to do that. Okay, cool. You can certainly raise your hand or you can put it in the chat and I'll read it out loud, whatever works best for you. Yeah, Nelson, please.
I'm sorry, he went out and sinned. It bothers me. So I'll give two examples. One example, like Sheila's case, where he would drive by yeshiva and shoot random people, or with his own technology. That's a sin.
Yeah.
Another example, something that happened to a friend of mine. He started eating bacon. All right, he shouldn't have done that if he wanted to be Jewish, but he wasn't going about harming other people. What is his sin? Why are we complaining about it?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm a particularly great biographer of Elisha ben Abuya, so I don't want to answer and be wrong. I will say the following. Your point is well made. There's one thing to make choices about yourself and another to harm others. And I think that point is very well made, right? They're not the same. And so I think two things are happening. One is they're not excusing Elisha ben Abuya's actions, right? If you're doing something that harms other people, it harms other people, and that's wrong. And your point is well made, and I think the Gemara would say that. The second thing is, if we understand, right, this whole section is about what about the rewards to mitzvot? If someone says, if you've been taught that the rewards are manifest in your life, right? The whole section about understanding this homiletically, right? If you understand Torah literally, it's going to drive you off the path. Let's just pause for a moment. What a profound statement that is. That is a wild statement, right? That we should not be reading the Torah literally. Now, I think the rabbinic process sort of already does that. This is earlier in the process, but I have to imagine that the rabbis are struggling just as much as Elisha ben Abuya. They come up with a different answer, which is not to leave, right? Elisha ben Abuya's answer is to leave, and again, perhaps do other things that are not so great. So yeah, I saw David, your hand up, and then Stephen, I see you.
Yeah, I unfortunately have to leave in about 30 seconds. My apologies, but I guess building a little bit on what Nelson was saying, I think that maybe, I like what you said in response, Rabbi. I think maybe another thing that's going on, though, also, maybe not here, but maybe some other places with respect to Acher, is the kind of bad example. I mean, we're trying, different streams of Judaism are constantly trying to figure out not only how do we make this meaningful for ourselves, but also for our fellow Jews. So when somebody leaves, especially somebody who is a prominent scholar, that could be a very big problem. He might take a lot of people with him. And I think some of this, we could talk about this at greater length at another time, but some of the post-Holocaust reactions maybe are a similar issue. And so I think part of it is not, is self-preservation as a community, and not only that as an example of what can happen if you try to take this too literally, although I'll agree that that's probably primarily what this paragraph's about.
So I want to say three things really quick. One is we definitely have examples of our ancestors in and around the Holocaust coming to America. I mean, those of you who have Eastern European ancestry, or as an example, I don't want to speak out of turn, who came to America with their tefillin in the Hudson, right? Who said, you know what, I'm free, I'm done, I don't have to do this. We have lots of that. Two, Shabtai Tzvi, a messianic figure, I want to say in the 1700s, could be the 1800s.
I think you're right.
Riled up all sorts of people and ended up converting to another tradition. And so it is hard for us to see leaders leave for one reason or another. And so, yeah, there's a challenge there. So I resonate. I have one other thing to say, but it slipped into my brain. Hopefully it'll come back. Stephen and then Bill.
So what he did was turn his back because he didn't want to confront the situation and work it out. And if Jews through the ages had done that, we'd be even smaller than we are. I think that we need to have stronger convictions than he did.
So it's really fascinating, right? That his choice to basically say, you know what, I'm out, to not deal with these complicated, painful things. I think there's some real truth there, right? I'll just add one other piece, which is the rabbis don't have a framework for this, but we do, which is about being trauma informed, right? That trauma does crazy things to us, and it's not easy to work through. I think we're better off when we do. I'll share my own just very briefly. I was a rabbi in Pittsburgh for 5 years, including overlapping the time with the shooting. And trauma is real, and how we deal with it is not easy. I'm still working through it. It was almost 4 years ago. And we make a choice. The choice of Elisha ben Abuya was to say, I'm done. And in fact, potentially to make harm to other people. That's not good. But I think, Stephen, your point is well made, right? We're better off if we work our way through the challenge, the trauma. We may not come up with answers, but we might be more healed from the going through instead of the ignoring of the problem. So well made, a point well made. Bill.
Yeah, I look at it, hard to believe, a little more cynically in a slightly different way. I think both he and the rest of the rabbis are doing exactly the same thing and saying, the word of God as we got in the Torah, it ain't solving our problems. And that's what we're reading literally. And so his response was, when I look at that, it doesn't solve our problems. And as Steve said, he's not addressing the problems, but he might also be making a commentary on how the rabbis were also saying it doesn't solve a problem, but we're going to come up with another way to solve problems. We're going to come up with additional methods. And he might just as much be saying, okay, the king is dead, but I don't want to say long live the new king. I'm just going to say that's the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, right. It's fascinating that the rabbis will quote Acher in other contexts, and yet having treated him as an outsider, right? That he has this funny status. And so I do think your point is right, that he's speaking in some way in response to the rabbi saying, your answers aren't good enough. Yeah, I think there's some truth there. This is what I want to say, and we'll end with this. These are the fundamental questions of being a human being. How do we deal with suffering? How do we deal with violence? For certainly those of us who live in the United States, we have a lot of it. How do we deal with it? How do we work our way through it? How do we become more whole as a result of it? How do we work our way through trauma, right? As Stephen was making reference to it. And these are not simple, easy answers. So I'm not going to offer you any homework, like come up with an answer and come back next week. I'm not going to do that because, we'd have a lifetime of trying to do that. But I think, as we enter, right, Tisha B'Av was this past week. As we enter this season, I like to think of Tisha B'Av as the beginning of the high holiday season. That between now and Simchat Torah, right, the end, we're going through a really powerful, spiritual, metaphysical, theological journey. And these questions about the role of mitzvot, the role of suffering, the role of God, are all a part of that conversation. So I invite you, at least from this point forward, to be in that conversation, even by yourselves, or ideally with each other and with us, where we're having a conversation together. Because this is part of what informs this journey that we're now on between here and Simchat Torah. So I leave you that as let's say mutual inspiration, right? That we can all be in that journey together. We'll see you next week, and thank you for being here.